Good morning, and welcome to Positively Politics, the show where we break down the sometimes complicated and often negative world of politics in a straightforward and academically rooted way. My name is Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. I'm an associate professor of political science here at the University of Indianapolis, as well as the host of this show here on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. And I want to thank you for tuning in and listening on this gorgeous Saturday morning. We were due for some nice weather again, in my opinion. And if you haven't caught the show before, this show's all about asking questions, inciting conversations. I like to think of it as a way to make sense of all the things going on in our political world. And there are some episodes where I talk about something kind of the periphery that I think more people should know about and we should dissect. This is not that episode because I'm going to talk about something that many of you are likely watching this Tuesday. And yes, that's right. This is the State of the Union analysis. This is the first State of the Union that we've had in the second Trump administration. I want to talk broadly about what the State of the Union does, what it has to offer, how Donald Trump delivered his address to joint House members of Congress and Americans alike tuning in on primetime TV Tuesday night. And what this says about the road ahead. In particular, if you listen to this show, I love, let's say it one more time for emphasis, love election season. And this really is, in a sense, a campaign speech, right? And so what does this tell us? What does this give us hints towards? But also, what does this provide kind of as a background, a context for what we expect to see this election cycle? So let's jump right into it then. You're listening here to Positively Politics on WICR as we're talking about the State of the Union address. So for starters, I think this is a big headline. I think it was kind of important, even if it feels not as important as the actual content, right? This was the longest ever State of the Union address. And there were many indicators before it even started that gave us a strong sense this might in fact be the case. For starters, it didn't start on time, and they don't always. I have to say, I regularly in my mind contrast State of the Union addresses to State of the States. And just like I love me some state government, one of the things I like about a State of the State address is regardless of who's governor, certainly Mike Braun has had short State of the State. I feel like it fits in his ethos. It's who he is, right? Direct, to the point, businessman, efficient. Right? But they're always shorter. They're always a reasonable 30 or so minutes. They're also at a reasonable time of day, right? 6 p.m. And I know Indiana is just straddling 2 time zones, unlike the United States, which covers 4 in the contiguous 48 states. I understand we're in Eastern Standard Time, so it's going to be later for us. But still, right? When the speech starts at 9, but doesn't actually start at 9 because the president doesn't come in until 9:05. And then there's a whole processional, which much like a wedding takes quite a bit of time. You've got the bridesmaids, by which in this case I mean the members of the cabinet. As you see folks coming in, of course, they're greeted by people. They stop, they say hello. Once the president makes his entrance, you get the selfies. I had to say, it was a little jarring for me. I think there's changes every year in the State of the Union, small things that either are unique to a president's personality and approach, or they're just a manifestation of how our culture, the times changed, and the selfies are that, right? But sometimes I like the changes, and other times I think it just feels out of place. I'm like, just not here. This is the State of the Union. That's personally how I felt about the selfies. They take a little bit of time. Sure, you want a picture with the president. I get it. But the State of the Union started late. So when we say the longest State of the Union, I think those were good indicators. And one of the other things we saw in this particular address were several moments of award giving, recognizing things that took an exceptionally long time relative to previous iterations. So you always have these guests of honor that are utilized kind of like in my mind, I'm like, it's like a figurine, it's an illustration or an example. But as a person, like, look, this is an issue. And here's this person. For example, you had the president talking about his new One Big Beautiful Bill that was passed last summer. And one of the things that legislation did is it stopped taxing overtime pay, and it stopped taxing on tips. And there was a woman whose husband works overtime, who works she works a tedious job, right? And President Trump talked about how she saved $5,000. She essentially made $5,000 more after his policy under the One Big Beautiful Bill because of the changes in the tax code. And she's there. We look at her. Everyone applauds. Right? But she's used as an example, a proxy. One of the things different in this State of the Union, though, you had longer, like actual awards being given out, and not just the announcement of the award, but the delivering of the award itself. We saw that several times. I'll talk later about the U.S. men's hockey team that won gold, USA, in the recent Winter Olympics. So that is essentially, I think, for several reasons, why we saw a longer State of the Union. We also know that President Trump doesn't necessarily stay on script, but the way that I think he reads the script is interesting. I noticed he would several times start on the left teleprompter, so to his left, leaning really hard into the podium, but not in a way in which he seems beholden to a script. I will say in his first administration, oftentimes, I think there was a lot of fair criticism that he would have words written for him, and he would start to read those words, and then he would deviate. And though you saw elements of that in the State of the Union address, it felt more natural. It felt built in. It felt like there was a level of comfort and confidence in that sort of delivery. Now, that leaning hard on the left podium, then to the left teleprompter, and then going to the right. And then, as I was taught in using teleprompters, you wait to go to the center camera with your teleprompter for the major statements, the ones that you want to address the American public. You look them in the eye and you deliver those key moments. There's always a little bit of ad-libbing from President Trump in a way that takes more time, and I think is, again, a large reason why we saw a longer speech on Tuesday evening. Now, I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. You're listening here to Positively Politics on WICR 88.7 The Diamond, as we're talking about Tuesday night's State of the Union address given by President Donald Trump, the first in his second term. It's fun to say. Right? And what we saw from that. So I want to start in terms of content. He opened up with the issue of immigration. And I think this is really interesting strategically because he went from immigration to the economy. And then both those topics came back up several times in the State of the Union. But that was an interesting choice. And I emphasize interesting here because immigration is a challenging subject in this administration. Right? On one hand, the president himself has credited immigration with being his winning policy. He thinks this is why he won in November, that he's strong on immigration. And on the other hand, recent polling has indicated that many Americans don't agree with our country's policy on immigration. And very specifically, I'm thinking of an NPR PBS Hour Marist poll that came out at the beginning of this month, was conducted at the very end of January, specifically with regards to ICE. And 65% of Americans in that poll indicated they felt that ICE, which is Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, had gone too far. Now, the president was careful not to talk about that, right? And that makes sense. I always love it when people say, are you surprised he didn't mention that? No, I don't talk about my problems and liabilities and the things that I've done wrong. Like, you focus in a State of the Union address, and generally in an outward, certainly in a public moment, you talk about your victories. You talk about the opportunities. You may put down some people. We definitely saw that Tuesday night, but you're not going to say, this is where I messed up. No president does that. I will add here too, I thought was interesting. Now, this is not an original analysis. I was reading about historical State of the Union addresses and preparing for this conversation. And I read that that classic line, right? The state of our union is strong. Right? Only once has a president ever not said that. It wasn't Tuesday night with President Trump. It hasn't been for a very long time, but actually Gerald Ford had said that it was not, in fact, strong, the state of our union, when he delivered the address, right, 4 or 5 decades ago. And the president talking about immigration to start with, to me, signified that he still thinks this is a winning issue for him. And dovetailing right from immigration to what I think most experts would say unilaterally, but I feel was a major issue in the 2024 election, which was the economy. Right? It was voters' referendum on the economy. And he went into the economy issues with regards to inflation. The president often claimed that inflation had gone down, that prices were more comfortable for Americans, though a lot of consumers report otherwise. And he also talked about the tariffs when he talked about the economy. This was a direct shout out, as I think most people, myself included, likely predicted, that we call out the members of the Supreme Court, those who were present, seated in the front row, who had just ruled against him in the decision with regards to his tariffs and his power specifically, the constitutional power that he had, or in this case, the Supreme Court confirmed, does not have to levy such tariffs as a part of the executive branch. And he called them out for that. But you saw immigration and the economy were foundational in this conversation. One other thing that he emphasized throughout the State of the Union was criminal justice. And I'd say this is a major point. This is typically a winning policy for Republican candidates. And President Trump has been very active in this policy. He talked about having troops in Washington, D.C., and making very bold claims that I think are oftentimes impossible to be upheld, right? There are too many loopholes. It's likely not true, or at least misleading, if not entirely inaccurate, but that it's the safest city now than it ever has been because of his approach in terms of criminal justice. So really focusing on those as the primary themes in the State of the Union address, which I think gives us a sense of where Republicans are going to be positioning themselves, or certainly where Donald Trump is focusing on and campaigning for congressional candidates for this November's midterm elections. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. You're listening here on WICR 88.7 The Diamond, as we're talking today about the State of the Union address here on Positively Politics, really dissecting what the president said, what the major themes were, what wasn't said, and what this means for our upcoming elections. Now, I mentioned political approval in terms of ICE. I want to talk about what this means, where this falls, right? The impact of this address right now in the president's administration. He is a lame duck president. He can't constitutionally barred from running again for another term. But he's in an interesting position because he's obviously very interested in keeping Congress Republican. And that's evidenced through his plea and the effort he put in the summer to try to redistrict several states' congressional lines, essentially to make it easier for Republicans to win this November. Now, he's aware. He has a vested interest in keeping his party in power. And for a president to enjoy unified government, that is really beneficial for their policies. So while there are certainly members of the Republican Party in Congress, I'm looking at you, Massey in Kentucky, that do not agree with the president on certain issues, it is a whole lot easier to coalesce your party and to have unified government where you have Republicans in charge of the House, Republicans in charge of the Senate, and Republicans in charge of the White House to get a Republican agenda passed, versus having divided government, which is possible, it's plausible. At this point, it's hard to say whether or not it'll happen, but could be the result of the November election, specifically with regards to the House. The Senate, in terms of the races that are up, because we have 6-year Senate terms, so it's a third of the Senate every cycle in Indiana. Neither of our senators are up for election this year. The Senate looks much harder, but if you're looking at the House seats, there is the possibility, again, to flip it from Republican, who currently hold the House, to Democrats. So for President Donald Trump, he's looking at this as an important, essentially, campaign speech, not for himself necessarily, though he can't resist adding him into that narrative, but truly for his party for the congressional midterms. And this is important because his power, his approval is not very strong right now. Last month, Pew Research indicated the president's approval was hovering around 37%. Now, there are all sorts of indicators, all sorts of different polls that show slightly higher or lower numbers. I will say the highest I've seen in recent weeks is 42%, and that is 5% better, but that is still well under half of Americans, right? And though presidential approval is precarious, right? Those numbers don't bode well. When we were talking about President Biden's approval numbers at the end of his term, right, his party suffered in part because of their affiliation with the president and people's general dislike of the president. And you see that almost regardless of who the president is, but the person becomes a proxy for everything that voters wanted you to do, but you weren't able to get done. Unfortunately, that negative perception, that cynicism is oftentimes pervasive in election cycles. So this was a campaign speech for the president trying to impact how Americans think and feel specifically about his party. And I want to cite one more poll that I think is influential here. Again, this is another NPR PBS News Marist poll, and this came out earlier this month, but showed 6 in 10 Americans feel the country is worse off now than it was 1 year ago when the president took office. So it's a different metric. You're asking a different question than approval. But again, something that shows this was an opportunity for the president to reach out to voters and say, I see the challenges, I have solutions, and I am addressing and putting them in play in this way. Now, let's talk about some of the other things the president covered. He talked about some of the positives in terms of the economy, right? So immigration is going to be a real challenge for him, and he discussed it. The way President Trump phrased it was that there were high inflation numbers under the Biden administration. They've lowered under him, which is not empirically consistent with the data. He did talk about gas prices, mortgages, and the housing crisis. I think his strongest argument in terms of the economy are the numbers in Wall Street. And though he discussed Wall Street and the stock market, I'm surprised this is not a bigger talking point, because when you're looking in terms of how to evaluate the economy, individual voters will use their own analysis, right? What is most important to them? Certainly for voters that aren't invested in the stock market or don't follow the market nearly as well, that might be a moot point. Right? And voters who are unemployed may care a lot about employment data. It's going to have some level of subjectivity and personal analysis to how something impacts you directly. But right, the stock market numbers, Wall Street is very good. And I think that is an opportunity for the administration to highlight that President Trump did talk about on Tuesday, but seemed like something that could have been influenced more. One of the things he said in the speech, essentially at this point, after talking about inflation, which he claimed is lower now than it was under Biden, and Wall Street, which is higher, is performing better now than it was under Biden, he said, what a difference a president makes. And in a nutshell, that was the phrase President Trump used in his State of the Union. I think you could call that his title for this address, because he regularly criticized the Democrats. He talked about President Biden several times. He really was trying to make this a conversation about him and his successes. And then informally, because this is somewhat of a campaign speech, right? You don't get all Americans tuning in primetime very often. And for some people, they'll certainly think about the election more before we come to November. But for some people, these next 8-9 months are not going to be as impactful as reminiscing and ruminating over this kind of phrase. He also said, another claim that the president made is, we're the hottest country anywhere in the world. Right? A lot of confidence in that statement. Many large claims throughout. And I want to let you know that you're listening here to WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson for Positively Politics. We're talking about President Trump's address in the State of the Union. And I mentioned the economy. That was something that was really important. He didn't talk about a legislative agenda broadly in the same way that often presidents do. And I like to think the State of the Union is sometimes this interesting address that you're trying to do so much in one moment. I will tell you, one of my college professors, Dr. Condi, I remember criticizing a paper that I wrote, and his feedback was, you were trying to do two things at the same time, and thus you failed at both. He probably said it in slightly nicer language, but I'm very sensitive to that kind of criticism. I was when I was 18, I'll tell you. But it was not wrong. I've thought about that and reflected on that in 30 years, right? You're trying to do too much. And the State of the Union, by definition, is always that address. Right? You're trying to talk about every policy. You oftentimes bounce between things. It's my least favorite aspect of the State of the Union because it's hard to follow and it feels put together like a puzzle that a toddler did where they really didn't care if the lines totally matched up. That is not a comment about any president in delivering the State of the State and State of the Union, but that is a reality of the address. That is what it looks like. I feel like it doesn't have as much organization and structure as a State of the State, and in part because you're talking for an hour and 48 minutes, and many people tune in at the beginning, but not everyone's going to stay till the end, right? You're trying to prioritize. You may talk about the economy several times, but you're going to talk about the things you really want people to know at the beginning, and then you'll talk about other things later, right? There wasn't your traditional legislative agenda that oftentimes presidents will utilize the State of the Union platform for, and that is to say, a president will say, I want to see Congress pass this. And my favorite thing about the State of the Union address is on face value, you're like, dude, you could just message them. You have legislative liaisons. You can call them. They will many of them happily, come running over to the White House to hear your proposal and to consider voting in favor or opposition or whatever it is you want. But that's different than the State of the Union. The State of the Union is a public address. That is what we call going public, right? Appealing outward in terms of politics. Don't just work on the inside, but put pressure from the outside. Speak to the American public. Communicate to their constituents, and then have your constituents call and write your legislators, your members of Congress, your senators, and your representatives, and say, look, I want you to pass the president's blah, blah, blah proposal. Some of the things that he talked about, right, and he did ask Congress to do, it really wasn't a clear legislative agenda. He talked about what he called like the Delilah Law. So this is banning commercial licenses for immigrants in the country. He spent a lot of time talking about immigration, talked a lot of time talking about crime. He did give a shout out to the SAVE Act, which actually passed through the House last week, almost straight bipartisan vote, but he did have one Democrat vote alongside the Republicans. This is a radical change in terms of election laws. One of the things it would do, it would require citizenship as proof to vote. It would also eliminate mail-in registration voting, which was a part of the National Voter Registration Act in 1993, a paramount piece of legislation that expanded voter registration access for Americans, would undo that in a sense. He talked about funding for Department of Homeland Security. That has been on a chopping block. That's been the partial government shutdown. Hasn't gotten a lot of attention, I have to say, but is polarized for what I would say is pretty predictable, obvious reasons, right? And then he did also talk about the Stop Insider Trading Act, which I think, had it been placed at a different point in the speech, would have gotten a little bit more attention. That essentially would restrict members of Congress and their immediate family, like their partners, right, from being able to trade on Wall Street. And that's something that does have bipartisan support, but just didn't seem to get the same kind of attention that it necessarily could have, right? Now, when we're talking about this speech here, and I'm talking here about the State of the Union on WICR 88.7 The Diamond, for Positively Politics, we're talking about this kind of speech, right? You have these moments of division, and I think President Trump leans into that. That's a unique part of his style and approach. But you also saw moments of unity, and there were great opportunities for this. The president routinely mentioned the 250th anniversary of our country. That's going back to 1776. And I will say I was not alive in 1976 when we had the bicentennial for our nation. But my grandparents were great patriots and huge collectors of all things Americana. And my grandmother had the plates that she so proudly displayed of the American Revolution, 1776 to 1976, in her dining room. I remember them well as a grandchild growing up. And I'm aware of like what a presence. That year was so unique for many things. And you saw 1776, the president mentioned this several times, kind of harken back to our nation's beginning. Now, it wasn't woven throughout the speech in a way that I could have seen it used as somewhat an undertone, right? Like there was division amongst the country, but we came together. And it was a time where we were struggling in foreign affairs, but united we stood. You didn't see it in that sort of way, but you did hear him mention it several times. I think you also saw, I want to mention that men's hockey team, right? Large applause for the gold-winning men's hockey team coming off of their victory, of course, against Canada in the Winter Olympics. And they came out several times in the speech. It felt almost like a game show. And this is one thing I'll say, it feels unique to the president, but I actually appreciated it. It broke up what would have been a very long lecture style speech and say, oh, and look over here, we have coming in door number 1, the men's hockey team. They came in with their cute little matching sweaters. They looked like a little team there, nice uniforms. They had their gold medals in their hand. And then the president invoked a significant award and honor on the goalie who played in that match and ultimately is credited alongside his teammates with the victory. So you saw that as a moment, right? You also had the World War II veteran who I believe is turning 100 years old on July 4th. It was a great story, right? Being recognized and also receiving an award. And you had a first responder from Texas. That one of the cutest things, little girl from Texas, a part of the Camp Mystic floods. You might recall last spring and summer, a lot of attention, horrible, devastating natural disaster in Texas. And at the State of the Union, the president motioned up to the balcony. You had one of the first responders who rescued literally, I believe it was over 100 children safe from the Texas floods, including the little girl that sat beside him. And I thought that was a really powerful moment. And again, an opportunity to unify the country. Now, the reality is that's not been Donald Trump's strength or goal, neither in the State of the Union nor in general in his approach to politics. I think that's in large part why his supporters staunchly love and support him, but also, of course, one of the aspects that makes him very divisive as an elected leader. He doesn't work towards compromise in the same way that we've seen previous presidents do that. And so I thought while you had some moments of unity, there were many other opportunities that could have been cited that simply were missed. You're listening here on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson, winding down our conversation here for Positively Politics. But I have to tell you, as we finish up in this kind of reflection analysis, one thing that I think is important, as I've mentioned several times, this is a campaign speech, right? This is an opportunity to capture a wide swath of Americans during prime time on a Tuesday evening when they probably have nothing better to do. I would have been sleeping, but I love me a State of the Union. I love a presidential address. Don't worry. I was up, I was watching, I was here for it. Hey, but this is a campaign speech. This is going to be an interesting primary election. I'm teasing to it because we're going to spend more time talking a bit about it after, of course, our state legislative session just wrapped up, so we'll talk about that too. But before the primaries, but you see primary challengers in Indiana, right, against those specifically Republican state senators that opposed redistricting back in December and effectively killed the measure in our state. You're going to see some really interesting races, North Carolina in particular, but nationally in terms of these members of Congress. Likely nothing too wild in Indiana, but you do see more candidates, quite frankly, and that allows for this opportunity for more competition. It's possible the Democrats could take back the House nationally in November. And likewise, the Republicans are looking to try to retain the unified government that they enjoy at the federal level. So there's a lot of little domino effects that could happen. There's a lot of little things at play. And when we're talking about a State of the Union address in an election year, it is informally that kind of election speech where you're trying to convince people, this is what I've done and this is what we will do. And I think for Donald Trump, the challenge was balancing the I with the we. Donald Trump is not on the ballot in November. It is not a presidential election in November, right? So trying to not just say, this is what I have president done, this is what I think is important as leader of the executive branch, but this is Republican members of Congress, right? People from my political party, what we have done and what we will do. That is his argument. That's what the argument needs to be focused on in the State of the Union to be truly effective at convincing voters, right, how to cast their ballots in November. Of course, a lot of time until then, and we will have a lot to talk about before then as well. But that will be it for our episode today. I want to thank you for tuning in to Positively Politics. For WICR 88.7 The Diamond, I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson.